He was one of the most famous and influential people in the history of humanity. His teachings formed the basis of Christianity, a religion that spanned over 2,000 years. And his followers live in every country right across the globe. So who was this man we call Jesus Christ? The plot of Brown's thriller centres around what he calls the greatest cover-up in human history, that Jesus Christ was not God in human form, but only human, a mortal prophet. In Brown's story, Jesus was secretly married to Mary Magdalene. They had a child whose descendants are still alive and well today. The novel's two main characters unravel a conspiracy by the church to cover this up. As a work of fiction, this book has it all. Religion, romance, sex, secrets, conspiracy, murder, even the Holy Grail. But where does the fact end and the fiction begin? Who was the real Jesus?
So you've never been told?
No, well, it was always this kind of unspoken thing with Mum, not to ask her.
She didn't tell you anything?
No, but she was really open with me about everything else.
Are you curious?
I used to be, but then I only really knew half of myself. And after a while I decided I didn't want to know what that other half was. And I guess I became scared of knowing. So I'm a quarter Irish, a quarter Welsh, and half, I don't know.
This is Nazareth village, a reconstruction of the Galilean way of life 2,000 years ago. In fact, this village is only about half a kilometre away from the real city of Nazareth, where Jesus grew up. Now, I say that with confidence because I notice that most authorities agree that there was a person called Jesus of Nazareth. Most agree that he lived and worked at the very time that the Bible said he did.
There is no question that Jesus Christ really lived, not only because it's recorded in the Gospels, but also because Josephus, the Jewish historian, in the 1st century AD, recorded the name of Jesus and some of the things about him. And the only way you can explain the existence of the Christian church is by believing that Jesus Christ actually lived.
You would be pretty hard-pressed to find an ancient historian who said Jesus didn't exist. Historians only disagree about the degree of evidence that we have for Jesus, how reliable it is, and to what extent it may have been garbled in transmission.
He's a priest. Did he even know about me?
Jesus left Nazareth when he was about 30 years old to begin his work as a teacher in the nearby town of Capernaum. Many people don't realise that Jesus' public life of teaching only lasted 3 years. And it's incredible the impact that his life had in such a short space of time. And his reputation spread. And we have more evidence from non-Christian sources that Jesus really lived. For example, the great Roman historian Cornelius Tacitus, who was born some 50 years after Jesus' death, documented Christ's death by Pontius Pilate.
Christus, the founder of the name, was put to death by Pontius Pilate, procurator of Judea in the time of Tiberius.
And then there's the archaeological evidence that supports events and places that are mentioned in the Bible. For example, this is St. Peter's home, built toward the end of the 1st century BC at Capernaum on the shores of Lake Galilee.
Peter's house was often mentioned in the Gospels as a place Jesus would retreat to. We know that from the Gospels that he was not welcome in his own town, in his own house. And so Peter's house became a very important home base for Jesus and his mission.
Another significant archaeological site that has been identified from Jesus' time is the Siloam Pool in the city of David. Here Jesus is said to have performed a miracle, restoring sight to a blind man. Christians also believe this is the site named in the Bible as the Capernaum Synagogue, where he's believed to have performed another miracle curing a Roman centurion.
Throughout the scriptures, God has used miracles to get people's attention. He was always healing people and doing miracles. It was to extend the kingdom to those people.
Christians believe that Jesus performed miracles, which proved he really was the Son of God with divine powers. According to eyewitness reports, he had the power to cure people from their diseases and to even bring people back from the dead. How are we meant to read these accounts of miracles? Are they just stories in a grand fiction even bigger than the Da Vinci Code? Or could they really have happened?
The miracles which are recorded that Jesus performed are all recorded by the Gospel writers. I don't know of any other writers contemporary with him who recorded his miracles. But after all, there were 4 writers who wrote their Gospels, and they were living at the time of Jesus Christ. I see no reason to discredit what they wrote.
Good on you, mate. There you go. It's a good stone. Just go that way, mate. G'day, Don. How are you, mate?
Pretty good, and yourself?
I'm not going in.
Hang in there. You're looking good.
We are going in. We're here. He's here. And Sarah,
What?
I'm hungry.
You're always hungry. Come on.
Mate, good on you. Hello there. New face. There you are. Hello there. How are you? There you go. Oh, yeah. Bit more there. That's the way. Good.
I'm so embarrassed.
I mean, it's understandable.
Well, I didn't know what to say. I just stood there.
Sarah, until the other day, your beliefs were based on a certain set of known truths. The world is round. Your mother gave birth to you. Your father wasn't a priest. And In fact, you didn't even know who your father was, but he certainly wasn't a priest. And now one of those fundamental truths has changed, and you've found yourself questioning everything you thought about where to put your faith in everything. You gonna eat that? Yeah. And Sarah, the world is still round. You just have to find some time to speak to him alone and find out what the truth is.
When Dan Brown based his novel on a real historical figure, he blended both fact and fiction. After all, his aim was to tell a good story. But his book has led to a great deal of controversy because many readers take some of his claims at face value. One of the central points in the plot happened here. It was a real event back in 342 AD at the Council of Nicaea. But that's where we leave the facts behind, because according to Dan Brown, Jesus' followers up until that point believed him to be a mortal prophet, a man who died for his beliefs. Brown's story goes that when the church leaders met here for this historic council, they decided to declare Jesus divine, the Son of God.
Jesus was viewed by his followers as a mortal prophet, a great and powerful man, but a man nonetheless.
Hold on. You're saying Jesus' divinity was the result of a vote?
A relatively close vote at that.
It wasn't a close vote. In fact, it was a hugely overwhelming vote in favor of this particular point of view. But the thing to stress in particular is that this was not a council called to decide the divinity of Jesus. It was a council called to decide in what sense is Jesus divine.
The majority of early Christians, including the Gnostics, believed that Jesus was divine for more than a century before Constantine. The overwhelming majority believed he was divine.
The Council of Nicaea was debating what is the relationship of the divine nature of the Son to the divine nature of the Father. Are they of one divine essence, or are there two divine essences? Nobody was saying, we think he's just human, but y'all think he's divine. Nobody was saying that.
You can't vote on whether Jesus is divine or not. You can vote on whether you are going to express Jesus as divine. It's got nothing to do with reality. It's dogma. Dogma is for the sake of people to wrap their heads around. Every representation of God is flawed. Nobody knows what God's like.
And while it might make a very good story, it's historically inaccurate to suggest that Constantine invented the doctrine of the divinity of Christ. A quick check of the earliest records shows that the divinity of Christ was clearly taught in the earliest Christian documents of the New Testament, the writings of Paul.
Virtually every New Testament book has some statement about the divinity of Jesus Christ in it. All those documents are 50 to 90, and I'm mentioning them not because they're in the Bible, but because they are our earliest Christian documents that give evidence of a widespread belief of Jesus' divinity in the first century.
Ignatius of Antioch, who is writing around 110, also very clearly calls Christ God a number of times, and it's startling the way he does it. It's just an assumption. He's not arguing it. He just simply states it, which means that that's already the faith in his community.
Already in the first century, Jesus is regarded by many of his followers as something certainly more than human. People are offering prayers to Jesus. Paul is talking about Jesus as being pre-existent, like God. The Gospel of John is talking about Jesus as being like God, the incarnate Word. So to suggest that Jesus was elevated to deity only in the 4th century misreads another 300 centuries of good, high, spectacular views of Jesus as divine.
Hey, we just got the results back from the lab, and I don't know how much time she has left.
I guess the big question that you really got to deal with at the moment is oceanic, indigo, blue, or melon, sapphire, hazel.
Go with the blue.
Oceanic indigo?
Yep. Yep. This looked really different on the roll. Do you like it?
Yeah, why?
I don't know.
There's also evidence from non-Christian sources that the Christians believed in the divinity of Christ long before the Council of Nicaea. One such example is Pliny the Younger, the governor of Bithynia in Asia Minor. In 112 AD, Pliny records and documents Christians worshipping Jesus as Christ, meaning the Messiah.
They, the Christians, were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ as to a god.
In that reference, Christ is referred to as God, not as a mere prophet. The Greek writer Lucian, who wrote 150 years after the time of Christ, records how the crucifixion was central to the early Christians' thinking and teaching, long before the Council of Nicaea.
The Christians, you know, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account.
The conspiracy theory in the Da Vinci Code hinges on another idea put forward by Dan Brown. Now, Brown wrote that Constantine, the first Roman emperor to convert to Christianity, had commissioned a new Bible to write out references to Jesus' humanity and recast him as divine.
To rewrite the history books, Constantine knew he would need a bold stroke. From this sprang the most profound moment in Christian history. Constantine commissioned a new Bible, which omitted those Gospels that spoke of Christ's human traits and embellished those Gospels that made him godlike.
The Bible commissioned by Constantine, fact or fiction?
Constantine simply ordered an imperial edition to be made of what everyone thought was in the Bible already. It was simply bringing out a large leather-bound, gold enamel fantasy edition because he had decided that this God had done him great favours by bringing him to the control of the Roman world. He ought therefore to pay back in honours to this God who had brought him to this great position.
Constantine, in fact, had nothing to do with the choice of Gospels, with the choice of the New Testament. That was something that lay entirely in the hands of the bishops and the church. Now, it's true that Constantine presided at the Council of Nicaea because he was the emperor, and he saw himself as the sort of the first among equals among the bishops. But he did not get into theological questions. He wasn't competent there.
Our first listing of the books of the New Testament that has all the books that we now have in it really goes back to Athanasius, and that's in 367 AD. That's actually after the Council of Nicaea. But what people need to understand about that collection is that the Gospels were well established by the end of the 2nd century. Paul's letters were well established by the end of the 2nd century. What was being debated on that list were mostly the little books of the New Testament, like 2 Peter, 2nd and 3rd John, whether these little books belonged in, along with Hebrews, and there was some discussion of the book of Revelation. So it doesn't relate to any of the core documents that relate to the presentation of Jesus.
So it seems that Brown's use of historical data here is not accurate, even if it does make for a compelling read. It's clear that early Christians regarded Jesus as divine. Christians have always taught that Jesus was God in the flesh, but set aside all of the historical confusion set by the Da Vinci Code, and it does raise an interesting question. Why is it that Christians believe that Jesus is God?
One of the key reasons that Christians believed Jesus was God was that he died and then came back to life again 3 days later. You can see behind me the dome of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, This is where many believe that Jesus was crucified. Jesus had already upset the religious leaders by his teachings, and they had heard about his supposed miracles. But when he announced the fact that he was the Son of God, that determined his execution, because they said, there's only one God.
So they condemned him on the grounds of blasphemy. But of course, when it came to his trial before the Romans, blasphemy wouldn't count. They had to find a political motive, and so they tried to accuse him of stirring up the nation and telling people that he was a king and that he was stirring up a rebellion. Well, of course, all this was false, but finally Pilate condemned him, not on the basis of evidence, but simply because of the clamours of the crowd, and he was afraid of his position as a governor of Rome.
This is the Garden of Gethsemane. The Gospel records say that Jesus often went there to pray. This may be the site here, although we can't be certain. This is where Judas famously betrayed Jesus with a kiss on the cheek. Crucifixion is a cruel and hideous form of death. Jesus was scourged by the Romans, then a crown of thorns thrust on his head. He then had to carry his own cross up the hill, where he was nailed to it by his hands. After several hours on the cross, Jesus died a horrible and painful death. But according to the Gospels, he asked God to forgive those that killed him.
Forgive them, for they know not what they do.
Jesus' death by crucifixion is recorded in Matthew, Mark and John, and all by the non-Christian writers that we mentioned earlier. Their records about the crucifixion are remarkably consistent. Now, Christians believe that what happened next, the resurrection, is proof that Jesus is God.
Did Jesus really die? Well, most experts agree with all the available evidence today that probably he did.
I don't think there's any serious historical doubt that Jesus was executed by the Romans at the suggestion of the Jewish authorities, who were hand in glove with the Romans. He was perceived as a threat, he was perceived as a leader of a large movement, and that made him even more of a threat, so they got rid of him. In fact, I think this is so certain that many historians use it as a criterion for judging other things about Jesus. Whatever we know about Jesus has to make sense of the fact that he was worth executing.
Now, many scholars believe that this is the tomb where Jesus was buried. Whether it's the exact spot or not, you can see how difficult it would be to get out once you were buried, assuming that you had been dead or not dead in the first place. A temple guard was placed alongside the tomb, a stone was rolled in front of the tomb, and it was set with a seal. These details are recorded by Matthew and Mark. Matthew writes that 3 days after Jesus' crucifixion, Mary Magdalene and 2 other women went to his tomb only to discover the seal of the tomb was broken and the body had gone. So what possible explanations could there be?
If you don't believe that supernatural events happen, then your job is to figure out what did happen, because it can't have been a resurrection. If, on the other hand, you have to say, to keep your conscience clear, well, it sounds pretty wild, but that's the claim, is it correct? Then in my view, as an historian, it gets actually quite hard to explain what did happen if the resurrection didn't.
When Mary Magdalene arrived at the tomb and found the body was gone, Christians believe that Jesus appeared to her and told her that he had risen from the dead. He also told her to go and tell the disciples that he had risen again.
If you were setting up a plot to try and get people persuaded that Jesus had risen from the dead, the last person you would choose as your prime witness is Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene is Mary Magdalene, out of whom Jesus has cast 7 demons. So what you're saying is your prime witness has a history of mental instability, yes? Oh yes, she's a good witness. And then there's the fact that it's she. Both in a Jewish court of law in this period and in a Roman court of law, women are not permitted to testify. They are not believed to be sufficiently rational. So your first witness is a woman with a history of mental problems. Oh, good move, that one. As far as I can see, the only reason the early Christians reported that Mary Magdalene was the first witness to the resurrection was that she was.
There are 11 recorded instances of Jesus appearing to the disciples after the resurrection. The most significant one is when he appeared to 500 right here on the Mount of Olives as they watched him ascend into heaven. What are we to make of this? Another miracle? Or could 500 people have got it all wrong?
The very fact that these people were surprised about the resurrection indicates that it wasn't a hatched-up story, a prefabricated story. It was something that happened, and they believed that it had happened because they saw it.
No historian, I think, would doubt that the tomb was found empty. The evidence is very, very adequate. What, of course, a historian stops short with is that his historical research does not embrace the possibility of a man being raised from the dead. It troubles me because it goes beyond what one can ordinarily know.
Jesus' disciples were plunged into despair when Jesus was killed. Some of them fled the city fearing that they would be next. So when Mary told the disciples that Jesus had risen from the dead, they were initially sceptical. And Jesus appeared unto them. And suddenly they were transformed from doubters who wouldn't tell anybody about him to believers who wanted to tell everybody about him. They were even willing to die for him.
What we see in the character of the followers of Jesus is an enormous change how they act before and after the resurrection. Before the resurrection, they were timid and they all deserted Jesus at the time of the actual crucifixion. But after the resurrection, we find stories that most of the apostles were actually martyred. They were all prepared to die for a cause. And what caused that change in attitude? I think the best explanation is indeed that Jesus indeed rose from the dead.
Within 3 weeks, they were preaching here at the tomb. Now, why would they stake their belief and reputation on that unless they really believed that Jesus was indeed what he claimed to be, the Son of God?
You're not going to die for a fictitious story, so unless there was authentic evidence at the time that he had risen from the dead and that he did live and work miracles and do what they claimed he did, people are not going to be prepared to sacrifice their lives, be tortured, suffer for his sake. And yet, look at the history of the early Christian church. What happened to early Christians is just indescribable. You've only got to read a book like Eusebius and read about some of the sufferings that were endured by early Christians. Are they going to do this for somebody who is a bogus person claiming that he did a lot of things that didn't actually happen? You've got to believe that they died for a cause which was authentic.
One of Jesus' most controversial acts was that he repeatedly claimed to be God. Now, this was a direct violation of Jewish law, and he knew it would mean that he'd be put to death. So why would Jesus make these claims knowing that the penalty was death, unless he really was God?
Now, he makes a lot of indirect claims about being the Son of God, being the Son of Man, being a messianic figure. And the way he makes those claims and the authority with which he speaks on his own authority. You've heard it said, but I say. There are a lot of aspects to his life that make very clear that he sees himself as a divine person, as the divine Son of God.
To Christians, the resurrection provides proof that Jesus is the Son of God. For his followers, it is proof of his divinity and that there is life after death. In this episode, we've had a look at some of the archaeological and historical evidence about Jesus. Now, Jesus' existence as a man is solid history. His divinity was celebrated long before Constantine of Rome and the Council of Nicaea. Dan Brown's conspiracy theory is good fiction, but it can't reshape history for anyone who looks at the evidence.
Yes?
I wish to confess. I've done lots of bad things, but what I want to confess today is that I think that you're my father.
Yes, I'm Father David.
No, I don't mean as in a priest father. I mean, I think you're my actual father.
What?
I think I'm your daughter.
The claim about Jesus' life and death is a wild one. But to Christians, Jesus' resurrection from the dead is compelling evidence that he was the divine Son of God, the Messiah, the chosen one. To his followers, Jesus' resurrection from the dead gives hope in all the rest of his promises. No conspiracies, no cover-ups.